Okay, this video gets pretty in-depth and if I'm not gonna lie, pretty complicated. So if you are just one of those people who doesn't care about math and wants no explanation for any of the perks that I'm talking about, I will be putting timestamps below for the points in the video where I just talk about the perks. But of course, if you want the full explanation and you want to just hear me talk for a while, you can just watch the video in its entirety. Alright, we're kicking it old school and revisiting the Silent Specter. And yes, I know, Thrasher, you're very, very cool. We'll talk about you in another video. But they changed a lot of things about this game, so I wanted to come back to my very first best perks video. Yeah, if you guys have been watching my videos on all the best perks for these weapons in Fortnite Save the World, then you might not have known that I started with the Silent Specter. If I'm not mistaken, I think that was the one that kickstarted this whole series because, well, people kept asking me what perks I ran on it. So here we are, like 150 episodes later or something like that. My point is, they updated not only the mag size perk and the reload perk section to also have a damage perk option, which wasn't a big enough change for me to really look into it, but they also added a fancy new 6 perk, which I will kid you not, right before I recorded this, I researched exactly one Silent Specter and got this. So I'm going to level this thing up and talk about the new best perks for this weapon because yes, there's a reason I'm recording this. This stacking crit rating perk gives us a lot more to talk about. Alright, don't tell anybody, but I'm recording this midway through recording. Disclaimer for all of the gameplay that you're going to be seeing of me using this weapon, in the left-hand slot is the stacking crit rating variant, and in the middle slot is the normal version with the slowed and snared damage on it. So I'm going to be switching between these weapons throughout the entire gameplay, just so you can constantly be comparing and contrasting these two weapons, and furthering my argument that the difference is so negligible that you might not want to consider changing your 6 perk. Alright, so the Silent Specter shouldn't need any praise. This is and was a top tier SMG. I ranked it number 2 in my top 10 list, and I honestly still stand by that. Yes, I know since first talking about the Silent Specter, lots of changes have come by, making the Thrasher kind of better DPS, and it is the better pick in pretty much every scenario, but a lot of people were talking to me about recycling their Silent Specter schematics, and do not do that. This thing is still a powerhouse, but with the new 6 perk changes, I think we need to talk about how this weapon fares in today's day and age. And I also want to add that the new 12.0 changes that I'm always referencing, because it shook up pretty much every weapon in the game, virtually did not affect the Spectre. It got like a teeny % difference. It's basically the same weapon as before. So if you're going to perk this weapon conventionally, well, this is kind of what I always recommended. Just to reiterate, the 5 headshots in a row and headshot eliminations are 2 things that you do not want. They don't really help this weapon at all. Yeah, you can get a little bit of extra area of effect damage if you have the headshot elimination, so if you're an early game player and this is like the first weapon you've got, sure, that's great actually. Seriously, just aim for the head, it'll boom the enemies around you, that will be nice. But when you are in the end game and you are trying to maximize every bullet coming out of your weapon, that is kind of a dead perk. I'm sorry. I mean, yeah, the group damage is always nice, but it doesn't really scale to the end game, so you don't really want to be looking for that. And the 5 headshots in a row is basically just adding a little bit of extra headshots and a brief period of time for a weapon damage buff that you can get for free by matching your 5th perk to your 6th perk. And if you have the slowed and snared or affliction variant, you can just add the plus 45% damage. Now, because the way the damage stacks in this game, it's not technically exactly 45%, and that difference can go up and down depending on what your loadout is. That is not within the scope of this video. Just know that this is a great option and a good way to go. It's perfectly fine if you have a slowed and snared or affliction variant. I will spoil, honestly, that the crit rating perk is technically better, but it's so insignificant that we'll get to it later, okay? Now, as for slowed and snared or affliction, that depends on when you're watching. As of recording this, affliction damage does abysmal damage. It's almost negligible, and if an enemy has like 5% HP, maybe it'll wither away a little bit, but what you're seeing in this video is the slowed and snared variant, which is what I've put on my fleet of 4 Silent Specters that I maxed out, because slowing an enemy down used to have a little bit more bang for your buck when it's stacked with the floor spikes that I always use, but I don't really get a ton of use out of it nowadays. I just think that slowing down an enemy is a little bit more effective than the negligible damage that you get from the affliction. However, they're both pretty similar. I think it really doesn't matter. If you have a Silent Specter with affliction or slowed and snared, you're golden, move on, okay? You're just use it, you're fine. Now, as for the actual best perks, crit rating crit damage does have a higher damage output than damage and fire rate. That is your other option. So if you want to have a no crit build, you can have damage and fire rate, and it'll be essentially the exact same DPS. The difference is like less than 1%. But the difference is you will be firing more bullets to compensate for the less overall per damage bullet of the crit build. And then as for the second perk, mag size is pretty much always preferred. I actually did have a reload variant of my stacking crit rating version with the fire rate, and I really didn't prefer it. So I kind of just always recommend mag size because you'll have more continuous fire, at least for the Silent Specter, because the 2-second reload time is more than comfortable enough, and having an extra reload speed on top of that isn't really necessary when you can get more total damage output in between reloads if you just have a mag size perk on there. As for the damage perk, this is one of the tweaks that I actually wanted to make to this video because that extra damage does very little. Because of what I mentioned earlier about how damage doesn't really stack the way you think it does, that 30% damage is not 30% extra damage. If you are physically shooting a smasher doing 200,000 damage a second, with this 30% damage perk, you are not suddenly doing 260,000. It'll actually be quite a bit less. And I've also experienced that because you're going to have no mag size perk to accommodate for that damage perk, you will be, in total, if you factor continuous fire and factor in the time spent reloading, you'll actually do less total damage output because you'll spend more time reloading than that damage will actually make up for. So, long story short, mag size is, in a weird roundabout way, more damage in the long run. Yes, you will be doing more damage per bullet if you use the damage perk, but because you're going to have to reload more often, I always recommend a mag size perk here. And now on to the more complicated part. If you have the stacking crit rating perk, we need to have a discussion. Note that I'm calling it stacking crit rating because every single shot ups your crit rating by 1.8 for 1 second, stacking up to 15 times. Now that gets very confusing, and we were able to actually crack this case. By shooting a tree with a pain train, we were able to see that your damage goes up for 15 bullets and it holds there. So long as you continually fire a bullet within 1 second of the last bullet fired, you will be stacking all the way up to 15 until you stop firing for 1 second. So long as you hold down on the trigger and you just keep shooting, you're going to have what amounts to a 27 crit rating. That is 1.8 times 15 for you. And the way that crit rating works is it's essentially just stacks on top of your crit chance. Now, what I always like to reference for this is this lovely Reddit post from forever ago. And what we're looking at here is 27 crit rating is conveniently enough so close to 27% crit chance that I'm essentially going to just treat it as 27%. You can see clearly that it's 26.5% chance to crit, but just for the sake of not breaking everybody's brains, we're going to call that 27 crit rating 27 crit chance. So if I didn't have a crit rating perk on this, as I can demonstrate in my schematic over here, it will have a 20% base crit chance, and then once I get up to 15 bullets, I will have essentially a 47% chance to crit. So long story short, that's why we call it the stacking crit rating perk. And so the perks change, they really do. And because of the way the damage functions, I mentioned that it doesn't really add up on top of each other very well. Well, crit rating doesn't either. And I've talked about this a lot in previous videos about diminishing returns, and that's what happens when you have two crit rating perks. So if you're going to have a crit rating perk down here and a crit damage perk down here, you don't want a second crit rating perk. And diminishing returns is in reference to the idea that one crit rating perk will up this all the way up to a 48% chance to crit. And because of the way that crit rating actually stacks, I can even demonstrate with this chart that the higher the crit rating goes up on this left side, the less it's actually helping on the right side. So that second crit rating perk does so little to actually help the damage output of the weapon that you'd literally be better off just putting a fire rate or a damage perk or a crit damage perk. Every other option is better than that second crit rating perk. And that exact same logic applies to our sixth perk here. As I kind of explained already, when you are up all the way ramped up and you are 15 shots in, your chance to crit is about 47%, slightly less as I showed, but about 47%. And that means that we kinda don't need a crit rating perk here. Now, obviously a lot of you are going to mention that we do need to ramp up to this, and this is why I'm switching between my weapons this entire time in the gameplay, and that's because it's not really noticeable. Most of the time, especially when you first start shooting, your chance to crit is actually going to be pretty normal. You're going to be wasting a lot of bullets just upping your crit chance. And fire rate adds a lot of damage, like I said, at the cost of damage per bullet. So if you want to maximize your damage per bullet, you want to go double crit damage if you have a crit rating perk. And that's kind of interesting because fire rate and crit damage is the higher total damage output, but you'll be shooting more bullets to attain the same DPS or slightly higher in this case. Now, another complication is the fire rate. So because we have the fire rate perk, we're actually reaching that higher crit chance a little bit faster, which can be a little bit convenient, but of course we're going there at the cost of extra crit damage. I know a lot of this is confusing. I know a ton of this has probably gone over a lot of people's heads, but this is kind of why I put off this video for so long, because it might look like a simple new 6 perk, but oh my god, does it change everything about this weapon. If I can even revisit an old case, maybe this will clear up a lot of things for people. I recommended Crackshot a lot in the early days. Crackshot and Bulletstorm Jonesy for that matter, because they have an ability where every single shot ups your damage, which looks really appealing. It's like, whoa, Crackshot in the support can give me a 50% damage buff? That's insane. Well, yeah, it'll give you a 50% damage buff at the cost of 50 rounds of your magazine. So you are constantly starting from 0 and you are constantly ramping your damage up. And personally, I really don't like that. And that's why, personally speaking, if you want a consensus on this, I will not be using the stacking crit rating perk. I can show the numbers on screen right here that it does actually do more damage. And because we're not matching our 5th perk to any 6th perk, damage to miss monsters and bosses is kind of our best pick. The impact and knockback on the Silent Specter is pitiful. The damage to stun, staggered, will essentially never happen. So the damage to miss monsters and bosses is essentially our only pick here. And it's actually a good one. It does quite a lot of extra damage to miss monsters and obviously bosses. So that's great. You can see against the Smasher, it should do a lot more on paper, but I didn't notice any difference. Obviously, I'm only using one Smasher in my little test here, but it kind of goes to show that in the real world, all these numbers flying around don't mean a ton. And that's where my consensus is that I think the normal 45% is just tried and true, and I will personally be sticking with that. But if you're trying to perk it for a crit rating perk, and it is the higher damage output, then yeah, fire rate crit damage, or crit damage, and then I already explained why mag size is the preferred. So I hope that video wasn't too much. If I'm a good editor, then maybe this was coherent, and I might even have to re-record this because this was very complicated. So as for the element, as just a final cherry on top, I'm going to link my elements video down below because that is just a more complicated topic. Match the zone that you're in. In this case, fire zones are everywhere, so I'm using water element on this, or energy is better all around. I'll let my elements video down below explain this in more detail. This was a ton of work to create. If you guys want to support the channel, feel free to use code Mista at your checkout. If you guys want to become a channel member, you can click the link in the description or click the join button on the channel. You get all these nice perks. I should also note that I am starting to stream primarily on Twitch, so if you're looking to become a member for the emotes in the chat, you might not get the most bang for your buck. You might want to subscribe over there. Thank you guys so much for watching, and have a nice day. And then